I'm about to tell what I think is a joke, but I've had about 50% of the people whom I've told it to have said, I don't get it. So this sort of comes out of a different realm, and we can take a moment to sort of explain it to each other if we need to. It goes like this. In the denominational headquarters of a large ministry organization, these folks were quite passionate about their theology, their understanding of God, and their doctrines and their creeds. And so they had a kind of their own culture. And their president one time fell ill and died, but he had made a request before he did that he could be buried right there on the grounds of the denominational offices in the wall itself. And so they made provision for this denominational leader and president to be buried when he passed. And so as a result of that, they prepared a coffin and a crypt, and they put him into the wall. And about 3 days later, they heard noise coming out of the wall. And so with that, they had some conversation among themselves and guessed that sure enough, they opened the wall, they pulled open the crypt, they lifted the coffin, and there their denominational leader was alive. They said, "My brother, you've been to paradise. Tell us, what is heaven like?" To which he said, "Nothing like what our theology has taught us." And with that, they shut the lid and pushed him back into the wall. It's okay. There's no embarrassment if you need some help. Just ask somebody next to you. We can get stuck in our creeds and our doctrines and our theology. And having grown up in a ministry home, although there were many, many beautiful characteristics, one of them for me was something that you and your community, led by your leadership, greatly values. So what I'm going to say today is not something that is new to you, not the kind of surprise that it was for me. You live in this kind of world. It's like water to a fish to you. It's the air that you breathe. But for me, because of both the way I was raised and also because of the kind of giftings that God has given me, I've gotten surprised along the way. Now, I find this kind of surprise in one of the chapters of the book of Acts, but it's a common theme throughout the Bible. Elijah wasn't surprised by the rushing sound. It was the still small voice of God. Moses had to pay attention to what he was paying attention to, which was a bush over there that probably wasn't unusual because he was deep into the wilderness to see a bush that had caught fire by lightning and was burning, but it caught his attention because this fire in Exodus 3, it kept burning, and he drew his attention over to that bush, and when he drew his attention in a whisper, God spoke to him about his next calling of leading the Exodus. But my favorite is in Acts chapter 16. Acts 16, if you want to go there, I'm just sort of going to talk through, not spend a long time there, so it's okay if you just want to listen. But in Acts 16 is where you can sort of validate and verify that what I'm saying is true, is that there is a story that for those of us who've sort of walked in the book of Acts or through the Bible a bit are familiar with, and that's the jailer at Philippi. The jailer at Philippi is unique in that Paul had intended to go one direction, but instead ended up going through a dream, a whisper, through a quiet thing. He ends up going to Macedonia and ends up in Philippi instead. It's 500 miles out of the direction that he intended to go. When he gets there, in the last half of the book of Acts 16, what we find is that Luke is recording for us an experience that they had where they are jailed for having done the ministry of God in that city, and the city leaders who are put at economic disadvantage as a result throw them into jail, and that night there's a great earthquake. And the Philippian jailer here, who have been hearing he and Silas singing and carrying on and all those kinds of things happened, when the earthquake happened and the prisoners were unfettered, and their chains fell off, he invited them into his house. They shared the good news, and the Philippian jailer and his household were all converted because of an earthquake. It's my understanding. It's the interpretation that I believe is what Luke is intending, is that the Philippian jailer, and I think I'm going to share something that perhaps many of us, if perhaps all of us, it only within the last few years, through an opportunity that I heard like this, that I think what Luke is actually doing is he's actually saying the Philippian jailer has gotten all the attention, but we need a correction. And the correction is found in the first half of the chapter. Lydia. I want to suggest to you that we may be surprised by Lydia. And that Lydia stands in contrast in the intentions of the original author of the book of Acts, Luke. That Luke is intending to say, hey, pay attention to Lydia. Watch for Lydia. So here's the story of Lydia. In the first half of the book of Acts, it records that Paul gets surprised, and he and Silas had 500 miles, and when they get there, they do what they normally do. What they normally do is they go into the synagogues of the city, and they begin talking and preaching. But all of a sudden, they find themselves drawn, I think probably because there was no response in the synagogue, they find themselves drawn over to by the side of a river where there is an Asian woman in a Roman city. Now, this is a little weird, but she's from Thyatira, we're told, which is over near Troas, which is where Paul has just come from. So instead of going just 30 miles that direction, he ends up going 500 miles that direction. And when he gets there, he's surprised by this woman who's sitting by a shore. And not only is she not Jewish, not only is she Asian, not only is she a woman, but she's sitting by the river, and she's a God-fearer. In other words, she's paying attention to the quiet. Now, God works in the earthquakes. He works in the circumstances. Many of us know what it means to get the snot knocked out of us, and through some calamity, all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a place, health, been there, done that, a vocation, job, fired, quit, whatever. We find ourselves going through a relational meltdown, etc., financial calamity. We know what an earthquake looks like, but here's Lydia sitting by the shore of a river as a God-fearer, having prayer, seeking God. And Luke is saying to us in this passage, Paul and Silas go out there, and she hears the message that she's been seeking all of her life. It's fulfilled in the person of Jesus. She and her household give themselves to a life of faith. And then I want to suggest to you, surprised by Lydia, that she then instructs Paul and Silas and urges them. The scripture says in this passage that they get surprised because she persuades them. She won't take no for an answer to say to them, come and stay in my household. Let me provide for you. Philippian jailer, go to his household of faith responds through an earthquake. Lydia responds through a whisper from a long-time desire. And then she persuades, and I think she instructs them related to in ever-increasing ways how God has the least among us in his mind, how God loves to speak through the quiet, not just through the loud. Acts chapter 16. And why is this text shrinking? Oh, goodness. Verse 13. And on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to a riverside where we were supposed that there would be a place of prayer. And we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. And a certain woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabric, that was she was wealthy, is the basic idea. She was an exporter and importer of dye and fabric for those who considered themselves royalty. A worshiper of God was listening, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household had been baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. And it happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, and then it goes into describing now what happens with the Philippian jailer and how they got themselves there. That the setup to the Philippian jailer is the surprise of Lydia to not overlook Paul and Silas, the things that are not dramatic, but are the simple kinds of things that come our way, the power of a whisper. Lydia is considered by the Eastern Orthodox Church throughout history, they considered her to be one of the apostles, which means that, at least as it relates to tradition, church tradition, that she continued to be a leader in this growing church movement. I've been surprised through my life by the power of a whisper. I went to a Christian college intending to major in music education. During that first year, I had to take educational classes and then some music classes. I did not have the kinds of giftings, but I invested myself in class harmony. I took private voice lessons. I joined the choir. I worked hard at a number of musical skills. And at the end of the year, in order to be accepted in the program to get a minor in music, you had to sing in front of the music faculty, which I did. And I think I did a rendition of Danny Boy. Would you like to hear it? No. Yeah. It's what my family had encouraged me in. It's some interest that I had taken. I had been in front singing solos, etc. So I gave my best rendition, and I stood in the hallway when Mrs. Fred Brown came down the hallway, my voice teacher. She looked at me and she said, "Rod, they like you very much, but the answer is no." I went back to my dorm room and buried my head in the pillow, had a good cry. I did what God is so gracious to do at that point in my immaturity, threw it open to something in Isaiah, and I've looked at it since, and it had nothing to do, but it ministered to me in some way. Isn't the Lord good and gracious to us? And in the power of a whisper, just the power of a whisper, never had thought this thought. I've come to recognize the Lord's voice. It's not my thoughts. It's not in the trajectory of my thoughts. The power of a whisper, the Lord said to me, "Take a professor instead of a course." So I opened up the fall schedule and saw the name Dennis Michelson, who, when he spoke in chapel, it sort of moved me in ways that the other chapel speakers didn't. I took a class called homiletics. It's the study of preaching. It's the first course of study that I ever excelled in without trying. And I mean, I was an average student, but in this course of study, the principles of communication made sense to me. Now, you might quickly misunderstand. First of all, I'm much more introverted than I think most people would imagine me to be. And secondly, the principles of preaching are not something that I thoroughly enjoy, but something that I'm able to do by applying the rhetorical skills that homiletics and preaching teaches. So I believe that the Lord has sort of uniquely gifted me to be the substitute of the substitute of the substitute in order to encourage the kind of teaching and preaching to say those who are farthest away, through some tools, if you have some desire, can be inclined to put two sentences together or to form something that could be helpful to a group of people. And that's been my life's work. All started with just the power of a whisper of responding. Take a professor, which is the advice I give to college students still today. What kind of people do you want to become? Not just what kind of study do you want to take on? I was then pursuing my theological studies in a master's degree program, and I was working at a church. And again, remember that this orientation that's common to you, the power of a whisper, the ministry of the Holy Spirit, the work of taking on the mind of Christ and believing that He's investing in us, this is not the kind of air that I was breathing and not the kind of water that I swam in. And so these, surprised like Paul was, related to Lydia's being available, was my experience. I was sitting then as an intern in a staff of a church of about 350 that my wife and I had been attending. And in this staff meeting, we had been discussing for 2 hours whether or not we should change the time for the Sunday school program. For those of you who don't know, that would be the adult education, which goes before the kind of the worship experience like we're having now. Whether or not we should change it from 8:30 to 8:45 in hopes that an additional 30 people would come if we would just adjust the time. And at the end of that 2 hours, of which I fully participated in, which I was thoroughly engaged to discuss and talk about, I went back to the closet and office in that little space there in Dallas, Texas, and I put my feet up on the desk, and in the power of a whisper, the Spirit of God said to me, "Are you going to give the rest of your life to this?" And I said, "Yeah." I've been preparing now 3 years of college, now 4 years of theological studies beyond, my investment in the work of a church, growing up in a church. Yes, this is what we do in church. And in the power of a whisper, surprised by God, the Lord said, "You don't know 10 people outside of your faith community who don't know the benefits of my grace. You've been to a Christian high school, a Christian college, and now 4 years of seminary. You don't know 5. You don't know 3. You don't know 1, and you don't care. And the woman who lives under you is facing a Christless eternity, and you don't give a rip." And I didn't. And that fast, just that fast, came on me a desire of an experience that I had had growing up, which was we used to take, back in that day, a part of the ministry when you could still pick up kids with parents' permission to bring them to church without, the fear and the threat of pedophilia, et cetera, you know what I mean. Back in that day, one of the strategies was running buses, and I, for a season, ran a bus and would pick up kids. All of a sudden, I had a desire to be on a bus route. I had a desire to just go into the street like I had done in college and preach. I had a desire to just sort of do something related to sharing the message outside of the same 350 people who knew the same message over and over again. Just a few weeks later, God sovereignly enforced that by watching a guy who was a classic cowboy sit on the second row of that church. Afterward, I went to him, invited him to lunch, sat with him. When he told me over lunch, I said, "How did you get to the church?" He said, "I grew up behind it." He said, "I'm not a church-going guy." Rick said to me, he said, "I just ended my 3rd marriage. I've got 5 children by those 3 marriages." He said, and so as a result of that, he said, "I was going on my milk route, and I thought, you know what? You're living back with your parents, and your youngest son is with you, and you've got up to your eyeballs in debt for alimony and child support." He said, "Why don't you go see what's in those doors?" And he said, I walked in. I said, "So how did you find it?" He said, "Well, my son had a good time." I said, well, tell me about your experience. He said, well, frankly, if you really want to know, he said, first of all, you guys sang songs from a book where the lines don't match. You know, Aaron, the hymns. You ever think about how you got to skip down to the next? He goes, well, I didn't know how to read it. And he said it was songs that were hundreds of years old. And he said, then your pastor told stories as if I knew them, and I don't, from a book I don't even own. And he said, now, no offense at all, but when you, at the end of the service, asked us to grab hands with people, he goes, I don't hold hands with nobody I don't know, especially a man. He said these words to me. It just seems to me that there ought to be a church for a guy like me to go to. And I drove home and told my wife, I know what I'm going to give the rest of my life to. Her eyes got about that big. Making a safe place for people like Rick and Lydia to have access to this amazing truth of Jesus and the Scriptures and the Bible in accessible ways. To sort of rob the best, this has been my life's work, to rob the best of academia theologically, to rob the best of communication skills, to take the best of the church world and to put it on the front lawn with a sign that says, for free. Through the power of a whisper, are you going to give the rest of your life to this? We moved to Central Missouri. We were involved in a church planting work. In the middle of that time, became clear that the curriculum was my wife and me. I went to work at the Stadium McDonald's as a maintenance man, trying to hold the vision together that I believe God had given me. And in the midst of that, at the end of 5 years, with a group of about 40 still hanging out, we couldn't find a place to meet. It just seemed like there was something else in the mix. And in my desperation, having never made, again, 1994, having never made more than $17,000, 7 years out of seminary, living in that season without health insurance, I said to myself, it's been a good run. It's God's vision. In the morning, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to put my resume out through Dallas Seminary, a fine, respected school with a Master of Theology degree. I'm going to put my resume out and going to go find a job in ministry that's typical of what many of my peers had done. And at 2 a.m., the Lord woke me up, sat in the living room, and in the power of a whisper said, just wait. I'm working. I don't swim in that world. I don't breathe that air, but I've had a few experiences. But I needed another fleece, so the next night, I didn't do the resume that morning, but the next night at 2 a.m., I'm sitting in the living room. I'm going to just wait. I'm working. That led to a ministry that some of you are familiar with, 2 decades of work, creating a kind of faith community that's safe and available for seekers. When that ministry came to a close in 2015, I found myself unable, through a dramatic situation that some of you walked through with my wife and I, unable to go to the church that I had invested 2 decades in. And one of those weekends, I ended up at a ragtag bunch of people who used to be out on Vandiver in a service where I had enjoyed wonderful breakfast. It was a monthly breakfast or so, or quarterly breakfast. So we ate good, and I came in, and people were kind. And in the service, Pastor Scott at that time got up and said, a woman has a prophecy. And she, perhaps you're here today, she said, this morning I was out walking in the street, and she said, there's a little snow on the ground, and I saw a little bluebird sitting right over on the side, and I realized it was flapping its wings. It had been injured. And she said, I then realized, oh, Lord, she said, I turned my attention, Lord, that's one of your creation. Would you be gracious to it? And she said, then I saw it in a little while. It took off, and it flew up into the morning sky. And she said, somebody here's got a hurt wing. And she said, you're wondering, I mean, how could she have known, right, that I had been on the MU website thinking, what job could I get? Leave the work of ministry. You know, us pastors, this is an aside, this is for free, but us pastors, we like to play a little game. I guess it happens in other vocations. I don't know. I just know the ministry world. But we like to talk about what we could have done in ministry. We like to say things like, well, I could have been a great attorney. I could have been a wonderful teacher if only I had gone. And we play these little games where we talk about it. And of course, we probably never could have found a job anywhere other than just in the church. But anyway, it's a thing that we do, and I certainly had participated in that from time to time if I had gone into this work, etc. You know, it's a way we sort of navigate sometimes, or I do anyway, our calling with God. And she said, but you're gonna fly again. She said, trust the Lord. And about that time, the musicians kicked into at the cross, where I first saw the light, which took me back to my home church where I first heard the whispers of God in my own life. At this point, my head is buried in my lap. The music is playing around me. I'm transported back to a time where I first felt the leadings and callings of God. And then Pastor Doug got up and he said, grace is what God does for you when you can't do for yourself. Grace is when you can't do for yourself. I had worshiped at the idol of being a pastor with integrity, and my integrity had been deeply questioned, at least in my own mind, in ways that had humbled me to the core, had taken away and stripped away that idol. And here he's saying, hey, do you have a need? Do you need Jesus? Do you need the Lord? And do you have a need that you can't do for yourself? That's what grace is. But that's not yet the power of the whisper. This was all quite a setup and quite a move, but it's not the whisper I'm talking about that morning. The whisper was, and I'm being vulnerable now with his life, but he did it publicly, so I could share it publicly. The secret is that I had walked with Doug and Sally's pain in the death and loss, the sickness, the long sickness of their daughter. So we had been at prayer summits together for days where he would bury his head and cry out to God in the pain of the loss of their daughter. I don't think you're picking up what I'm laying down quite yet. What I'm saying is, even as powerful as his message was, it was his resilience and he and Sally's faithfulness that he would even be preaching about grace in the midst of such great loss. Are you feeling me now? That the Lord said to me, hey, if he can sustain, if I gave him the resources, if I give to them the resources to keep the faith in the midst of the trial, I was wrecked by the work that I had already seen him doing, and the fact that he was breathing and ministering in the midst of the kind of grief and agony that I had watched some years before undid me, and I got the grace that I had always longed for all my life. I called my children and my family together at 2 o'clock that day, and I sat in the living room. I told them the story, and I said, I have been the older brother, I knew I was, of the prodigal story who longed for the grace that the prodigal received. And this morning, I received it. And it didn't come in an earthquake. It didn't come, yep, we hear you, Lord. Call on in. It didn't come in the power of a dramatic shaking, but in the power of a whisper, by paying attention to a bush, by looking over at the riverside, by a woman, an Asian woman, 500 miles away from where she should be, saying to you, hey, perhaps you should come to my house and learn hospitality for the Gentiles. In those kinds of ways, in the power of a whisper, God said to me in that moment, Rod, I'm enough. My grace is sufficient, whatever you're walking through. About 3 years before that, 2015, I knew that a storm was brewing in the ministry that I was serving, and that I didn't have the skills, and I didn't know some things about the ways my trauma and sin's impact on me, but I knew it was going to get bad, and I wanted out. And I said to my wife in August of 2013, I think it's time for me to go give myself to theological education by teaching in a seminary or Bible college. My pastoral ministry has served me well. I want to make the kind of investment that my mentors made for me during my earliest years in my 20s. To which she said, God's not in that. And I said, oh, he is, and you just watch. And I said, in fact, I was on the internet last night, and the seminary that we graduated from has an opening in the pastoral ministries department, and when I'm with those professors at, again, the Evangelical Homiletic Society meeting, which is where the trainers of preachers and teachers get together every year, I said, when we're at that meeting, I bet the Lord's going to just open up an opportunity for me to say, hey, if I applied, would you consider me, blah, blah, blah. She said, oh, I don't think so. Well, you better get ready to move to Dallas or to Canada or somewhere, because this is what I want to give my life to, is further education, and I just want out of town to avoid the crisis we experienced. We get out to the Homiletic Society, and sure enough, Timothy Warren's there. He's one of the leaders at that seminary. My mentor, Don Sanukian, is there, who now teaches at a prestigious but who is a mentor at Dallas, and he's there. And I asked Don, hey, what do you think if I went and taught seminary? He said, oh, Rod, God's in that. He said, I could see. He didn't say that. He said, Rod, I could totally see that. And he said, when you're ready, just let me know and I'll help you. And my spirit ran cold. And I don't even know what that means. It's not the air I breathe. It's not the water I swim in. But my spirit ran cold. The next day, a guy that only a few of us will know, his name's Jack Hayford. He used to speak at Promise Keepers. And Jack Hayford was the plenary speaker for this group of pastors, professors and some pastors, mainly who don't even think the Spirit is still speaking in the ways in which we are talking about today. And he's talking about things like breathing the Bible and the Spirit of God. Anyway, and he's 80 at this point. And Jack Hayford says, in the middle of his talk, he says, I once had lust for a woman in the denominational office of the Four Square. It has nothing to do with teaching, preaching, hasn't to do with pastoral ministry, but he's off on a story, and like me, many of us are rolling our eyes in the back of our head. And Pastor Hayford, well respected, he goes on to say, he said, I prayed and prayed and prayed about it. And he said, He said, I was walking down the hallway of the Foursquare denomination, and he said, it left me. This has nothing to do with whatever, I don't know how he got there. It left me. And that fast, the power of a whisper, that's on you. I'm like, on me? A deceiving spirit, he said. I don't name my spirits. Hadn't until then. A deceiving spirit is on you. And then he said, I'll tell you how you always know deceiving spirits. He said, there are two ways. Number one, he said, it's always self-serving. And because he's 80, I had written 1 period, 2 period. Because he's 80, he never got to number 2. But I wrote down, in the power of a whisper, I wrote down, play it out over 8 or 9 years. In other words, do you really want to be a professor living in institutional chaos? The frustrations of vetting and tuition and stories that get old about how you used to pastor people. Do you really want to be involved in your... No disrespect for the teachers in the room, but I was talking, Spirit of God was asking me, or do you long for the kingdom game as it relates to church life? Spirit of God, you got a deceiving spirit. You should have seen my wife's joy when we walked through downtown Disney. And I said to her, you won't believe what happened to me in the last 24 hours. I told you God wasn't in it. This last one, and then I'll wrap it up. In another dramatic turn, we had 3 years of chaos. In 2017, just suffice it to say, my wife's parents, who had lived with us for 20-some years, with agreements that we made to see to their care, exceeded our capacity. And lovingly and respectfully, but with a lot of pain, they flipped their lids. And as a result, they left and moved into an unsafe situation with another family member. And he got to drive illegally, and they didn't burn up our house, so, they passed away this past year with those realities. But we were left with more house than we could afford, for sure, in that season, or even needed. And in 3 weeks, we sold and bought a home that I found. You're not only the guys whose wives make the decorating decisions and would pick the house would understand. But in this dramatic season, I found a house. I said to my wife, hey, do you think you could live there? She said, it's not bad. We looked at it. I loved the house from the start and still do. Moved from the country to the city, blah, blah, blah. My brother's estate had taken, who was single and not a good manager, took 3.5 years to untangle. And it was settled in the very season that we needed it, in the midst of this pain and drama and trauma. This is very simple, just very simple. We put an offer on the house, and of course, someone else put an offer the same day. So now we're in the 2 thing. So we're trying to get our house sold, the condition, hopefully it'll go quickly. We're working off, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and the Lord just prompted me. I knew who the previous owners were. Jim King, longtime CPS. Some of you probably knew him, principal at Rockbridge High School, had passed away. His wife then had dementia. The estate's trying to sell the house. The Lord prompted me in the power of a whisper as I'm sitting there sort of fretting, thinking about how it's going to work out. The Lord just says to me, hey, write him a letter. I don't even know if I knew it was a thing back then, but now I guess it's my forever home, I write a letter that basically says, hey, I respected Jim. I had the occasion to meet him. The house, we have intentions for it related, I said it in appropriate, abstract, not concrete, specific, like, we're going to call Jesus down in there or anything. It was just like, hey, we're going to do good work there, and it's a house that fits us in a need. My realtor rolls his eyes and says, oh, I find these letters don't do anything, but if you insist, I'll include it. At the closing, that realtor said they looked seriously at both offers, but it was your letter which persuaded them to accept yours. In the power of a whisper, pay attention to what you're paying attention to. And while we trust God for the dramatic, while we believe him through the circumstances of life that he'll take care of us, that the safest place on earth is within his care, I'm going to invite the band to come close us out. In the midst of all that, pay attention to the power of a whisper. Hey, Lord, what would you say to me? How might I be, like Paul was, surprised by Lydia? Like Luke said, hey, you can get an earthquake, but how about just by sitting by the river? Just as a God-fear, trusting that the Lord will come. And some of us need today, we need to hear from the Lord. So would you pray with me? So gracious God, give to us ears to hear, hearts to listen. And may you surprise us when we most need it. Lord, in the faithfulness of every day, we look to your word. We trust the mind of Christ that leads us and guides us in our circumstances. But we need, Lord, your whispers be true to who we are, to be true to who you made us to be, to not be swayed by what the others are doing and saying and by how culture lives and what the church community says. By, Lord, the doctrines and the creeds which declare that heaven can't be like that. Lord, surprise us. In the power of a whisper, give us listening hearts by your grace. Bless us as your people. In Christ's name.